Most modern gardens fail for a simple reason. They're worked too hard and fed too directly. Gardeners till constantly, chase deficiencies with bottled nutrients, and restart the system every season. The result is more labour, more problems, and less food. Older gardens produced more with less effort because they weren't treated as projects. They were treated as systems that improved over time. And once you understand how those systems actually worked, the difference in results is not subtle. This isn't about nostalgia, it's about efficiency. You know, older gardens were, well, built to mature instead of being reset every single year. Traditional food gardens weren't torn apart annually. Beds stayed in place for decades, allowing them to develop and thrive over time. With undisturbed soil, you see, there's a lot to gain. Soil structure was allowed to stabilize, which meant roots grew deeper, water infiltrated more evenly, and those crucial microbial networks stayed intact. But when you till deeply every season, oh boy, you collapse pore spaces and destroy fungal networks that took years to form. What happens then is you get a short-term flush of growth, sure, but then compaction, runoff, and nutrient loss follow. It's a cycle that's tough to break. In practical terms, a garden bed that hasn't been inverted in 5 years will outperform a freshly tilled bed, even with fewer inputs. I've tested this in raised beds side by side. The undisturbed bed needed less water, fewer amendments, and produced heavier harvests by the 3rd season. Fertility was layered in slowly instead of dumped all at once. Older gardens were fed continuously, not aggressively. Compost, manure, leaf litter, and crop residues were added in thin layers over time. This prevented nutrient spikes and fed soil life steadily. Modern gardeners often add 2 inches of compost once, plant heavy feeders, then wonder why growth stalls mid-season. Older systems avoided that by keeping organic matter coming. You know, a half-inch layer of compost applied twice a year does more than a single heavy application because it stays biologically active. In raised beds, adding 1 inch of compost every spring and another half-inch in midsummer keeps nutrient cycling stable without overwhelming the system. That's less work than constant fertilizing, and honestly, it produces more consistent growth. Older gardens were designed to hold water, not drain it away. Soil, rich in organic matter, absorbs and retains moisture, which really reduces irrigation needs. Mulch was standard, not optional. Bare soil is a modern invention. It dries out faster, erodes, and overheats. Older gardens covered soil with straw, leaves, or living plants, which moderated temperature and protected structure. In my own beds, a 3-inch mulch layer reduces watering by at least half during peak summer. That's less effort and less stress on plants, which translates directly into higher yields. Older gardeners planted for adult size. Modern advice often encourages tight spacing to maximize yield per square foot, but that only works in systems with constant inputs and perfect conditions. Crowded plants compete for light, water, and nutrients. They also create humid microclimates that invite disease. Older gardens space plants so air could move and roots could expand. For example, spacing tomatoes at 24 inches instead of 18 reduces pruning, lowers disease pressure, and produces nearly the same yield with less intervention. The plants do more of the work themselves. Older gardens rarely relied on single crops dominating a bed year after year. Rotations were common and diversity was normal. This reduced pest buildup and balanced nutrient use. Legumes were used intentionally to rebuild soil. Deep-rooted crops brought up minerals. Shallow-rooted crops followed to take advantage of surface fertility. Even in small gardens, rotating families instead of specific crops makes a difference. Brassicas, followed by legumes, followed by fruiting crops, is a pattern that works in beds as small as 4 by 8 feet. Older gardens weren't weed-free. They were weed-controlled. Mulch, dense planting and cover crops suppressed weeds by limiting available space and light. You know, constant hand-weeding is really a sign of a weak system. A well-fed, well-covered bed produces fewer weeds because, honestly, there's just nowhere for them to establish. In practice, this means accepting some volunteer plants while focusing on soil coverage. A bed with living roots year-round, well, it needs far less maintenance than one left bare between crops. Older gardens were worked with hand tools because they had to be. That forced efficiency. Beds were narrow enough to reach across. Paths were permanent. Labour was conserved by design. Wide beds and long reaches waste energy. Permanent paths prevent compaction. In raised beds, keeping width to 4 feet or less and never stepping in the soil maintains structure and reduces corrective work later. Even in hydroponic systems, older garden principles apply. Systems that rely on constant correction and sterile conditions require more effort. Bioactive hydroponics, where microbes buffer nutrient availability, produce steadier growth with fewer adjustments. The lesson is the same. Stability reduces labour. The real reason older gardens worked better is that they got easier over time. So, older gardens were investments. The first year, honestly, was the hardest. But every year after that, you needed less work for the same or even better yield. These days, modern gardens often do the opposite, becoming more and more dependent on inputs as the soil degrades. If your garden feels harder every season, well, something is wrong. A good system should feel like it's helping you. Building that system means leaving soil alone, feeding it consistently, covering it always, spacing plants honestly, and, letting biology do the heavy lifting. That approach works whether you're growing in the ground, in raised beds, or in controlled systems. It's not trendy. It's proven. If you care about growing more food with less effort, subscribe to Easy Garden Life. And if this kind of practical, experience-driven gardening helps you get better results, share this video with others who want their gardens to work with them instead of against them.